Hello, this is Panda Consulting's ArcGIS workshops, and this workshop we're looking at using attribute rules for annual DOR submittals. Now, while we were focusing on Florida, I think many of these things are just applicable to other states, and it really is just looking at how you can use attribute rules to perform some of these simple things that often we need to do with our annual submittals. So first, I want to go over again and remind everybody to go out and check out our website. We've got a lot of information on there, including if you want to know what events are coming up, you can look to our events calendar and see it there, what options we have. If you don't like it in a calendar format, you can actually look at the workshops and events page, which is under here, which will go and show you a list of them together with show you all past workshops and give you links to how to go and download them if you're looking, or actually a link to go and watch it on YouTube. Speaking of YouTube, we do have a separate page for our YouTube channel, and that link will go and take you over to our YouTube channel, which has all of our previously recorded and published YouTubes. We actually have now somewhere around 70 different videos up there for you to go and look at. Some of them are an hour long, some of them are an hour and a half long, but there is some very good material up there, and hopefully you'll find that informative. All right. So let's talk about this. By the way, Chris is actually monitoring or moderating right now our chat room. And if you have any questions, thank you, Christopher. If you have any questions or any discussions on here, or you'd like me to go over something a little bit closer or a little bit more detail, go ahead and put something in the chat window and Chris will interrupt me and see if we can make this a little bit more interactive. So the first thing, let's talk about sort of the DOR requirements. The DOR the Department of Revenue on an annual basis is looking for each individual county property appraiser in Florida, not assessor, but appraiser, to go and submit their data for certification. And one of the things they have to do is they have to have a GIS tax parcel polygon feature class with a specific attribute field named PARCELNO, so that every single county has this PARCELNO on it. They can have name fields and parcel IDs and all this other things, but they have to have a PARCELNO. And then the value that is stored in that PARCELNO field has to be a value that's consistent with the tax roll or the CAMA data. And the reason why they do this is so that they could go and join the parcel polygons with the CAMA data and to check to see whether there's any things that don't join, whether there's any missing polygons, and they can begin to start doing some statistical evaluation of the values that are assigned to them. So this is the first requirement. You have to have an attribute field named PARCELNO on there, and that the values in there have to be able to join up to the tax roll data. The second requirement that seems to be problematic is they're looking for parcel dimensions. They want to have parcel dimensions that are shown on the deed or on the plats, whatever the original conveyance deed would have on it. They want to see that. And same thing with lots inside of subdivisions. We'll often, on a national basis, we call these conveyance divisions, and these are lots within conveyance divisions. And also in Florida, we have a Department of Revenue requirement for subdivision dimensions. So let's sort of look at one of the counties in Florida and what we do and how we wind up doing this. And if I go to the tax polygon, All right, if I go to tax polygon and look at my attribute table on here, all right, let me go in and make sure I turn this thing on for editing. So you'll see I have a name field. I have other fields in here. I have the parcel no field, which is required. I also have a property appraiser link field, which goes and links over to their actual website. And if possible, goes and actually links to the actual search and gives me actually that parcel on the website. And then there's others, but it's these two fields here that we're most concerned with. And to let you know, this is the parcel no field is a text field. So you want to make sure that you attribute it for that. And if you'll notice, the name field and the search field all have that same structure in that they have dashes between what is in fact, this is the section, township, range, subdivision, block, and lot components of the tax parcel ID. And if we go to tax roll and open up a copy of their tax roll, we see in fact that while the parcel name inside the polygon feature class and the link over on the website has dashes, as it's stored in their tax information, it does not have dashes. So the first thing we have to do is we have to figure out what are we going to do to make sure that that parcel no field is properly populated as we go and make these edits for it. So what we have done is a couple things. One, any existing data we'll go through and we'll calculate that field to make sure that it's exactly as it should be. All right. And the easiest thing for us to do is go and use an arcade script. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to take that name field, all right, the value that's stored in the name field, and then replace, all right, replace out of that name field. And then the replace function has a comma, and then the value that you wish to replace in parentheses. It can be a single or a double in arcade. So we're going to replace every dash with, in this case, nothing. So we're going to get rid of it. All right. So this is going to be the script that we run to get rid of all of the dashes in our data. I've already done that on this data set. We don't need to do it again, but I want to make sure that we understand what this script is doing. This is a simple replace, because what we're going to do is we're actually going to go and create an attribute rule that's going to go and automatically, every time we go and build a new parcel, it's going to go and make sure that the values that are stored in parcel no are correct as far as the formatting. Before we get into that, there's some problematic parcels in this county, and that there's some that are coded as TBD, and we find this often where they'll code to be determined, or gaps or overlaps, or some sort of parcel that they don't quite know what to do with. And that's acceptable, because that's not going to cause our attribute rule to fail. But at least we want to make sure that, you know, we all in our county data have some sort of anomaly that we're going to have to deal with. So let's go and look at an attribute rule. So in order to go to the attribute rule, we'll right click on the actual layer and go to data design, and first go to fields to make sure, let's put it up here. Let's put it up here so it's easier for us to see. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we have a parcel no field. And in this case, we do have a parcel no field as part of our data set to be exported out. So we know we've got the parcel no field in place there. The next thing we want to do is we want to go to data designer again and look at attribute rules. Let's move this up here again. So in our attribute rules, we actually have under calculation as part of this county's data, we actually have 4 different attribute rules that automatically fire off. An attribute rule, by the way, goes and fires from the top one first, then it goes to the second one, third one. And so when it actually goes and executes them, even though they all have the same triggers of when you create something new or when you update it, they are actually executing from the top down. So that the first thing this is going to do is going to calculate this PARCELNO field, attribute field, to go and do what? We'll look over here. Here's the name of the field. Here's the field that it's actually going to populate. And then right here, we can look at this expression and it will show us that this is exactly that expression that I typed in before. It's going to take the values that are stored in the feature name attribute field, and it's going to replace all dashes in them with nothing on here. All right, I'm going to test it, and that's then just sort of to follow up on creating an attribute rule. We're also going to make sure that it goes and triggers or is going to run every single time we create something new or every time we update it. And an update could be a geometry update, such as we can change the shape of something, or we could do a split or something like that. Or it can be an attribute update. As soon as we change a number, it will automatically go and do that. So let's look at that in real time. Notice if you're familiar with the parcel fabric, this is actually a parcel fabric, and I turned off the records. I don't need a record to actually go and demonstrate this. So I'm just going to go over and I'm going to create a new parcel polygon in here. And I'm just going to go and digitize this thing in. When I get done digitizing it, it will actually go and select it for me. So here it is. There's no name field. There's nothing in here yet. These are some of the other calculated, the automatically triggered attribute rules, and we'll look at them shortly. But in here, the name field is the one that I'm going to fill in. And in this case, I can tell it that it's 03-05-19-123-008-0-1 is going to be my new tax parcel. And I can attribute it before clip or after clip. But in this case, as soon as I hit return on this, it's going to get triggered as a modification to the attributes of this polygon. It's going to fire off the attribute rules again, all those attribute rules that are set to get triggered every time I do a modify. So when I go and hit a return on it, watch what happens to the PARCELNO field on here. All right, it automatically went and ran through and set it up so that my PARCELNO field automatically got populated with the value that's stored in my name field with all the dashes replaced. And so there's no dashes in here anymore. There's other things we could do with this. For example, in Florida, and in this case, we have values that must be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 characters long. We could also go and set up a constraint rule that says you have to check that the PARCELNO is at least 16 characters long so that we don't wind up with something like this, a TBD, and have that stored in there, because that's really not a valid parcel number. Or having anything else in here. Again, because we don't have any real error checking on this, it's automatically going to go and populate it like that again. That may or may not be what we want to do, but we can go and do it just to let you know. It's something that when you're looking to design your database schema, and again, this is whether it's in ArcGIS Pro or whether it's in the ArcGIS Parcel Fabric, you want to think about the rules that you have. Again, we could set this up not just to do an automatic calculation, but we could tell it to do a constraint rule. The constraint rule is over here. We would tell it to make sure that it's a certain length before you go and actually utilize it. So again, something you can think about, something you want to consider maybe going and using for the population that you're doing in here. So while we're looking at that, let's look at some of the other rules that we have in here. This next one that gets executed is creating a value for the PA link structure. And in this case, this is actually, it turns out that there's a search string that can be sent to the property appraiser's website. And that each of these is different, depends upon how they've gone and implemented. But in this one, this is a fairly simple one, in which is just going and referencing an individual server and then the search string, and it's an active server page search string, and it looks for a pin as the index number, and then it just wants you to put in place the value for the pin field. And in this case, in this case, the pin is stored in the name field, but if it were inside of the PARCELNO field, we could click that and modify that. But that's how it's actually going and populating this value. And if we actually look at it, it took whatever I had stored in the name field and is actually storing that as that pin value. If we go to an actual real parcel here, this parcel here, and look at it, we can then go and fire this off. And let's actually just copy this value and store it over here, because I did a select and not a, and it will actually go and bring up that actual parcel out of the property appraiser's website. All right, pretty handy, not tough to do, especially when you're dealing with Arcade in there. It's a very simple rule. Just go and populate what that search string is, and then what value actually has to be put in place there. And again, that's being updated every single time we create a parcel, or every time we update either the geometry or the attributes of that parcel. The next one we have is an Arcade calculate acreage. And again, this is a simple one, and this is populating the calculated area field. And it really is looking at the Arcade geometry functions to be able to pull out of that polygon feature object. It's pulling out and calculating the area of the $ feature and returning acreage in here, acres. We could also have it set up, depending upon what this is, to return square feet or hectares or whatever we're looking at here. But the Arcade geometry object actually allows us to go and pull the area and automatically go and return the value to us in acres. I really like this. Secondly, there's a domain, a coded value domain inside of the parcel fabric. And the value that's stored here is that it's actually acres. So these are sort of the standard types of rules we might put in place here for the polygons. Do we have any questions or any suggestions on that, on what we've done? We've looked at the ones that are associated with this one requirement for the Department of Revenue wants to have an attribute field in there called PARCELNO, and that PARCELNO has to have a value which matches what's stored in our tax roll so that it can be joined to the tax roll.
We don't have any questions in the chat currently.
Okay, thanks, Chris. All right, so let's go back here. Let's delete that and let's move on to the second part, which is the Department of Revenue has a requirement that says that they want to see the dimensions, and they want to see the dimensions that are stored on the recorded subdivision plat. If you're in Wisconsin, the certified survey map or the actual deed. And so they want to differentiate between just dimensions that are calculated, dimensions that are inversed, and the actual deed dimensions on here. And so that's the first thing. We have to differentiate between what's truly on the record documents and what's just calculated as part of the GIS. So we're going to do that by using an attribute field inside the parcel fabric line feature classes called COGO type. This COGO type field is a long integer field. It's a numeric, but it has a coded value domain against it. And that coded value domain has three values. It has 1, 2, and 3. If I actually look at the domain, I'll see that, again, it's long integer. So these are numbers, but the values that are stored on them are 1 for entered, 2 for from geometry, and 3 is computed. The entered means this is the record information that the editor has actually gone and input into the Traverse tool or any of the other COGO enabled tools, whether it be using any of the COGO that's available to us. That's what entered means. It's been entered in there. From geometry, or number 2, means that this was actually inversed or calculated by using the update COGO fields. All right, so those values probably are not reflective of what the record information says, what that record document says. Those are just sort of, a calculated value on here. And then the third value is this computed. And this says a value of number 3 on the coded value domain. This says it's computed. And we'll actually look at what happens with that and what that computed is. So we're going to use the value that's stored in our COGO type to determine whether or not we go and populate in a new field that we have in here called dimensions. So the question is, why do we have a dimension field, which is a text field? One of the things we've found is that the Department of Revenue, again, they had to find a way to tell the difference between the number values that are stored in the distance field and the actual record information. And even if we did just use the COGO type field to tell the difference between the two, inside of this field, this is a numeric field. And unless they have a copy of the project file, they don't know whether you're carrying it out to 3 decimal places or 2 decimal places or rounding it up to the closest integer value in there. So they've requested that there be some sort of way for them to specifically see what values are being stored in here. To do that, we've created this dimension text field. And we're going to go and input a value into that field, which allows us to reflect that this is what was stored on that deed or on that record on here. So we've got a combination in here. We've got to have something which goes and defines what the COGO type is on the line. And then if it is a COGO type that we think it's a good value, we got to fire off an attribute field that goes and captures the value that's stored not only in the distance field, we also have to remember about the arc length field. So we have to be able to determine between the two, whether it's a curve, whether it's not a curve. If it's a curve, we want to go and store the arc value in the distance field, in the dimension field. If it's a straight line, we want to store the distance value in there. So it's a little bit trickier on here. Let's look at actually the way this works. So let's go and draw a line. All right. And I'm going to draw a line, and I'm going to use the constraints, a direction and distance constraint here. And I'm just going to do a north 45 degrees for 200 feet. All right. And when I look at that, you'll actually see that I have some values in here. These are the values that are stored. And then inside of here, it tells me that this is actually, I entered this in. And then I have an attribute rule that says if the line has COGO values and it's marked as being entered, to go ahead and populate the dimension field with that value, and then in parentheses, mark it as being a deed value. Let's explore that a little bit more. So let's go here to my attribute rules for my line feature class. So here is the calc dimensions on here. And this is the attribute field. It's a calculation attribute field, and it's going to fill in the dimension field. All right. Let's go through this a little bit. So the first part, what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called dim for dimension. Just this is what we're going to deal with. And then it gets a little bit trickier with arcade. And that what we're going to do is we're going to say that we're going to ask to see whether or not the arc length, whether it's a curve. If it's a curve, or let's put it this way, if it's a straight line, if the arc length does not have a value in it, if it's empty, if is empty, the arc length field, all right, then our dim variable, we're going to take the distance field, round it to do decimal places, and then we're going to add a space. We're going to add a foot indicator and then a space, and then put the parentheses around it. However, if it's not empty, if our arc length field is not empty, it means it's a curve, in which case we're going to set the dim variable to instead be the arc length field, the arc length value, round it to do decimal places, and then put the same thing at the end of here on here. So this first part of this expression is just determining what we're going to use and what we're going to copy over to the dimension attribute field. Now, this next part, I actually expanded it out. This is not the most concise arcade code that you can write, but I wanted to go and write it in such a way that it's understandable. So here's now what we're going to do, what this next part, the rest of this here, what this does is it actually goes and analyzes. It goes and analyzes the actual COGO type to see what COGO type that's set as, whether it's set as entered, whether it's set as no value in there, or whether it's set as computed or calculated on here. So it's going to look through those values. So the first thing is going to be is if in fact there's no COGO type set, because that's one of the possibilities. Just don't do anything. Just return null. Don't calculate anything over there. So that's just sort of some error checking in here. The next one it says, if in fact the value in the COGO type field is equal to, that's what the two equal signs is in the arcade language, is two equal signs says is equal to. It's not equal to, it's an expression to go and actually analyze this and say, is this equal to this? If it is equal to 1, then it's going to return the dimension for me and actually return that and say, whatever value is stored in a dimension, go ahead and populate it into, or whatever value is stored in the variable for dim, populate it into the dimension field. Then we go down to the next one. Well, what happens if it is not entered, if it's not a value of 1, but it's a value of 2? If it's a value of 2, we do the same thing as if it was null. We do not go and calculate anything into that dimension field, because that means that that was inversed. And we don't want to go and send that to the Department of Revenue. We want to make sure that they understand that that was just something that was either scratch or it's something that was calculated and you cannot rely upon it. However, this final option here, which is if that COGO type is 3, if it's equal to 3, which is the computed value, that means that at one time, that was an entered value. It had a code of 1, but you did something to it so that it would go and you divided it or split that line up, or it was clipped out so that those values can be relied upon. They may not be the original record dimension, but they are sort of the result of its function against that record dimension. So maybe you split it in 2, or maybe you split it in 4, or however you divided it up. It will go and say, this value is still a good value that's stored in here, so don't throw it away. It wasn't a 2, it wasn't an inverse value. It was actually computed off of a good value to do that. So that's the actual arcade expression to go and use for this, to go and make sure that this works. And again, we have it set up so that it gets triggered when a line is created or when a line gets modified. All right, so how does this work? So just sort of to go and look at this further, what happens if we go and we just go and create a line here? Notice the line has no value on it, so nothing gets stored in here. If, however, we store a value in the distance field, all right, because we have not set the COGO type yet, it doesn't do anything with it. However, if we set the COGO type to entered, it will then go and populate this dimension field and say, this was a good value for us. And you notice as soon as I did that, it went and put that in. If I change it back to from geometry or inversed, it will remove it from the dimension field. So in this way, we can be sure that what it's actually doing is it is determining whether or not the values that are stored against this line, whether they're reflective or derived from record information or deed information on here. So let's set this back to maybe this was entered. And again, by the way, let's just go and put a value on here so that it turns into something other than that. It's not red anymore. So that will determine, and again, that leads us to go and make sure that when we provide this to the Department of Revenue, they can go and determine, oh, the dimensions are the deed dimensions that are provided on here. All right. So what happens then if we go and divide this line that we have selected? Well, if we divide it into 2 equal parts using our divide function, and I go and say divide, it has divided that into 2 equal parts. And you'll note it recalculated the COGO on there. That's one of the functions on here. And if I look at the attributes of this, it then says, there's my bearing, divided the distance. And now what I have is that that's no longer entered by me, but it was computed by a function that I did on here. So that now this has the COGO type of computed, or a value of 3. So it still goes and stores it out for me on here and allows me to go and provide something to the Department of Revenue so they have some confidence in where these values actually came from. All right, so now that we understand how this works, let's look at, well, what can we do to go in and make sure that this is correct in here? Well, I can go back and look at the lines that's part of, for example, these lines that are part of here. And in this case, I can say this was entered, or previously, if it had not been entered, it may have just been from geometry. And I can quickly go through here and repopulate and reevaluate my lines. For example, maybe it turns out that this distance should have been 1,300 feet according to the deed. All right. So I can type in on this line that this is 1,300 feet and it was entered by me. So by manipulating the distance field, the COGO type field, and the use of these attribute rules, I can go and prepare something to be sent into our Department of Revenue and help them to be able to evaluate this data so that it automatically gives them a greater level of confidence that this is reflective of the information. Let's go do one more thing just so we can play around with this a little bit more. Let's go and actually create a curve. All right, and we'll start here, and I can do a circular curve on here. And let's just make this a circular tangent curve to this. My radius could be, a 250-foot radius. My arc length, by the way, it could be a chord length, an arc length, or a central angle. Let's do the delta angle of 45 degrees. And let's make it to the right instead of to the left. Let's change this one more thing. All right, and let's put that in. Let's look at that line and what it actually has in it. So in here, the distance, or the direction on this is actually the chord bearing of a curve. We looked at it. The distance on a curve, the distance field contains nothing in here at all. It's set to 0. Our radius is the actual radius that was input by us. Our arc length, it winds up being calculated as 196.35. And because we had it actually entered that value in, it is an entered, and it actually stores this value in here. Interestingly, if we wanted to, we could set our attribute rule that if it stores that, instead of saying D, it could store L for the arc length on here. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's go in and save these. Let's go back to our attribute rules and actually modify it so that if it is an arc length, instead of typing the D to denote that this was a deed, it could actually go and tell it that this is the arc length on here. And if we look at this again, here's where we actually establish a dimension. Here's where we evaluate whether or not the arc length is empty. If it's empty, it means it's a straight line. So we don't want to go and modify this. But if it's not empty, remember that exclamation point in front of the empty means it's not empty. then in fact, we're going to put this value in, the value of the arc length rounded to 2, but we're going to call that L instead of D. Let's go ahead and check this. Let's go ahead and say, okay, and let's save this attribute rule now. Chris, I see we still don't have any comments or any questions or anything.
That is correct.
I may have just overwhelmed everybody. I don't know. We'll see. Or this may be so simple, it's like, yeah, we kind of knew that already. We don't need to ask any questions about that. You know, I have to tell you, after working with ArcGIS Pro for almost 5 years now and looking at attribute rules in the last couple of years, these attribute rules are some of the most powerful tools and functions that are inside of ArcGIS Pro. The ability to go and do more than just edit simple lines anymore is pretty amazing. So by the way, this is still the value that's stored in there. Let's set it back to 0. And now let's see if it actually works. When I change this to entered, the dimension should actually say 196.35 and then an L afterwards. There it is. So it goes and allows us to go and automatically determine whether or not this is a distance that's stored by the deed or whether it's actually an arc length. And let's do the same thing again where we go and split this. Last time I used a divide. In this case, I'm going to go and split it just by using a split. All right. And it went and automatically calculated those values for me because these are COGO enabled lines. It went and set it to compute it. All right, so what happened here? Why is it computed? It turns out that it set it to compute it, but it didn't necessarily fire that attribute rule off. There's still little anomalies with the triggers that you want to be aware of. The divide did, the COGO automatically calculated, but it didn't necessarily fire that off. So just be aware that there's some little things you want to watch out for. You want to make sure that it's in there, but yeah. So let me go and select this in here just to make sure that that actually is now marked as being computed. It has to be a modify in here. There it is. Fired off. All right, we're getting close to 45 minutes with this. Is there anything? Let's ask this one more time. Let's go and look at our slides one more time. So here's where we went through and noted what the modifications were. Again, we had to have that PARCELNO field. It has to be the values that are going to join with the tax roll or CAMA data. And we took care of that by going using this attribute rule that had an arcade expression of where it went and replaced all the dashes with 0 in it. Interestingly, what happens if the inverse was correct? If you wanted to add dashes, where maybe you had stored no dashes and you wanted to add them, well, it turns out here's the arcade expression for an attribute rule to go and do that. Now, this element is going to go and be different depending upon where you need to add those dashes, but it just will sort of signify what you might want to do. The first thing we want to do is we want to test to see whether that name field has a value in it. We don't want this thing running if it doesn't have a value in it. And we're just going to say, okay, well, if it doesn't have anything in it, don't add a bunch of dashes into the null value. Don't just add dashes in there. Don't do anything. So and that's always a good practice to go and put that when you're going and doing a calculation rule to make sure that you don't add the values in here. And then in this case, we're going to go and create a variable called input. Could be dim again, but we're going to create it input. And in this, we're going to say, if there's dashes in here, get rid of them. We don't want any already entered dashes in here. We want to input them all ourselves as part of this expression. That's what this line does. And then finally, this line is going to return, here's the arcade for it. And I wanted to show you one of the options you have is on the left side of this, input it, take the input value, and at the second position, go and input this. And then at the midpoint, and the midpoint will give you the starting position and the number of characters it's going to go across and add this. And then finally, the right function will allow you to do it at the very right end of the. So here's a couple different arcade expressions on how to go and modify text strings to add dashes or replace dashes, those sorts of things on here. So that was the PARCELNO field. The second one, this was the arcade rule that we used for tax parcel lines. And we actually have it on lot lines and subdivision lines for the Florida Department of Revenue. We want to make sure that they have these values in here. And again, we putting in here where it's being marked as a D for deed. And then we want to copy the values, the COGO values of the correct COGO attribute fields rounded to 2 decimal places. And that's what this is. This first portion, test to see whether it's a curve or a straight line. And once it does that, it then has this variable fully populated and ready. And then we determine what's the value in the COGO field. Sorry. What's the value in the COGO type field, and whether or not to go and stick that variable values in there, or whether to not do it in there. All right. Any questions on this? Hearing none, I'm gonna stop the workshop today. Thank you all for joining, and we'll move forward, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. We're going to show you an alternative to annotation. Thanks. Thanks for attending, and we hope you enjoyed this workshop. If you have questions, would like some more details about anything we discussed during this workshop, or if you or anyone at your organization would like information about training, support, or ways in which we can help you with your GIS needs, please contact me at frank@pandaconsulting.com or call me at 561-691-3277, and we can discuss how we can help you with your needs.